The crystal chandelier crashed to the marble floor, its 1,000 pieces scattering like diamonds across the ballroom, as Margaret Whitmore stood frozen, holding a manila envelope that would change everything. The billionaire Harold Blackstone's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to my daughter." The DNA test results in Margaret's trembling hands weren't just paper anymore. They were a weapon that would destroy the most lavish engagement party of the year and expose the cruelest deception imaginable. What started as humiliation became the sweetest revenge when a forgotten blood test revealed a truth that would make millionaires weep and expose the darkest secrets of high society. Margaret had always believed she was born to struggle. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that the world owed her nothing. Her auburn hair, always pulled back in a practical ponytail during her 12-hour nursing shifts at St. Mary's Hospital, caught the morning light as she walked through the modest apartment she shared with her 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The scar on her left temple, a souvenir from a childhood accident when her foster father pushed her down the stairs, served as a daily reminder of where she came from. But her green eyes held something unbreakable, a fierce love for her daughter that had carried her through nursing school, through her divorce, through every humiliation her ex-husband Richard had served her. "Mommy, are you really not coming to Daddy's party?" Emma asked, her small fingers tracing patterns on the kitchen table where Margaret was reviewing medical charts. The innocence in her daughter's voice made Margaret's chest tighten. How could she explain that Richard Pemberton, Emma's father and her ex-husband of 3 years, had specifically requested that Margaret not attend his engagement party to Vivian Ashford, the pharmaceutical heiress whose family wealth traced back 4 generations? "Sweetheart, sometimes adults have parties that are just for certain people," Margaret said gently, though inside she burned with the memory of Richard's lawyer, calling to inform her that her presence would be inappropriate and potentially disruptive to the celebration. The same man who had once promised to love her in sickness and in health had reduced her to an embarrassment to be hidden away. Margaret's childhood had been a series of foster homes after her mother died when she was 7. She never knew her father. The birth certificate simply listed "Father Unknown." Mrs. Henderson, her last and kindest foster mother, had encouraged her to pursue nursing, seeing something special in the way Margaret cared for injured animals and younger children. "You have healing hands, dear," Mrs. Henderson would say, watching Margaret bandage a bird's broken wing or comfort a crying child. That calling had sustained Margaret through everything, including her marriage to Richard. They had met at a hospital charity gala 5 years ago. Richard, then a rising partner at Pemberton and Associates law firm, had been charming and attentive. He pursued her relentlessly, sending flowers to the hospital, taking her to expensive restaurants she felt uncomfortable in, whispering promises about the life they would build together. Margaret had been 29, tired of dating men who couldn't handle her demanding schedule, and Richard seemed different. He said he admired her dedication, her strength, her independence. The first flashback came to her now as she watched Emma coloring at the table. It was their wedding day, 3.5 years ago. Margaret had worn her grandmother's simple pearl necklace, the only valuable thing she owned, passed down from the mother she barely remembered. Richard's family filled the church's right side, while Margaret's consisted of Mrs. Henderson and a handful of co-workers. During their vows, Richard had looked into her eyes and said, "Margaret, you are my heart, my strength, my everything. I promise to stand by you no matter what storms we face." His mother, Patricia Pemberton, had smiled tightly from the front row, her designer hat casting shadows that seemed prophetic now. But storms had come, and Richard had not stood by her. The first crack appeared when Margaret couldn't get pregnant immediately. Richard's comments became sharper, more cutting. "Other wives manage to give their husbands children and maintain perfect homes," he would say, after finding a coffee cup in the sink or noticing she hadn't had time to grocery shop after a double shift. When Emma finally came, Richard seemed to view her as Margaret's responsibility alone. Night feedings, daycare drop-offs, doctor visits, Margaret handled everything while Richard's career flourished. The second flashback was darker, more painful. Emma was 6 months old when Margaret discovered the first affair. She had come home early from work with a migraine to find Richard on the phone in his study, speaking in low, intimate tones. "I know, darling, but I can't leave yet. The baby is too young, and Margaret would take everything in a divorce. Just give me more time." Margaret had stood in the doorway, holding their daughter, watching the man she loved plot her betrayal. When she confronted him, Richard had been cruel in his honesty. "You're not the woman I married anymore, Margaret. You're tired all the time, you have no time for me, and frankly, you've let yourself go. I have needs." The divorce had been swift and merciless. Richard's law firm connections ensured Margaret received minimal alimony and child support. "Consider yourself lucky," Richard had said during their last meeting. "I could have fought for custody. Emma deserves better than a mother who's never home." The cruelty of it had nearly broken her, but Margaret had channeled her pain into determination. She picked up extra shifts, enrolled in advanced nursing courses, and slowly rebuilt her life around her daughter. Now, 3 years later, Richard was marrying Vivian Ashford in a ceremony that the society pages were calling the event of the season. Vivian represented everything Richard had always wanted: old money, social connections, and a life of luxury he felt he deserved. At 28, she was 6 years younger than Margaret, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of ethereal beauty that graced magazine covers. More importantly, she was the sole heir to Ashford Pharmaceuticals, worth an estimated $200 million. Dr. Sarah Chen, Margaret's closest friend and colleague at the hospital, knocked on the apartment door that Saturday morning. Sarah had been Margaret's anchor during the divorce, the one person who saw through Richard's charming facade from the beginning. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked, settling onto the couch with 2 cups of coffee. "I'm fine," Margaret lied, but Sarah's knowing look made her shoulders sag. "Okay, I'm not fine. Emma keeps asking why she can't bring me to Daddy's party, and I don't know what to say. How do I explain that her father is ashamed of me?" Sarah's expression hardened. "Richard Pemberton is an entitled coward who never deserved you. But Margaret, there's something you should know. My cousin Jenny works for the catering company handling tonight's engagement party. She told me some interesting things about the guest list." "Sarah, I don't want to hear gossip about Richard's party." "This isn't gossip. Harold Blackstone is attending tonight." Margaret looked up sharply. Harold Blackstone was a name everyone in the city knew, a self-made billionaire who had built his fortune in real estate and technology. His charitable contributions to hospitals, including St. Mary's, were legendary. But why would he attend Richard's engagement party? "Vivian's father and Blackstone have business connections," Sarah continued. "But here's the interesting part. Jenny overheard the wedding planner talking to Richard's mother. Apparently, they're worried about something. Mrs. Pemberton kept saying we can't let anyone know and the timing couldn't be worse." Before Margaret could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard's number, which was unusual since he typically communicated through lawyers or Emma. "Margaret, we need to talk." Richard's voice was tense, lacking his usual condescending tone. "If this is about tonight, I already told you I wouldn't attend your party. That's exactly what I'm calling about. There's been a complication. Emma has been telling everyone at her private school about the party, and some of the parents are asking questions about why her mother isn't attending. Vivian's mother thinks it would look better if you came just briefly to show that we're a civilized, divorced couple." Margaret felt her anger rising. "Now you want me to attend? As a prop to make your new family look good? Look, Margaret, I know we've had our differences, but this is important. Vivian's family has certain expectations about appearances. Just come for an hour, smile for some photos, and then you can leave. And if I refuse?" Richard's voice turned cold. "Then maybe we need to revisit our custody arrangement. Emma is getting older and she needs stability. A full-time mother who works around the clock isn't ideal for a growing child." The threat hit Margaret like a physical blow. Richard was reminding her that his family's wealth and legal connections could challenge her custody if she didn't comply. "Fine," she said quietly. 1 hour. After hanging up, Margaret stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The simple black dress she had planned to wear to work the next day would have to suffice. She couldn't afford a new outfit for Richard's society party. As she applied makeup to cover the dark circles under her eyes, Emma appeared in the doorway. "Mommy, are you coming to Daddy's party after all?" "Yes, sweetheart, just for a little while." Emma's face lit up with joy, and Margaret felt her heart break a little more. Her daughter deserved better than parents who used her as leverage in their bitter games. The Ashford estate was a monument to generational wealth, with its sprawling grounds and Georgian mansion that had been featured in architectural magazines. As Margaret's modest Honda pulled up to the valet station, she felt every eye on her. The other guests arrived in luxury cars with drivers, their evening wear clearly custom-made. Margaret clutched her small purse and tried to summon the confidence that had carried her through nursing school and single motherhood. The ballroom was magnificent, with its crystal chandeliers, silk-draped walls, and a live orchestra playing classical music. Margaret estimated there were over 200 guests, all moving in circles she could never access. She spotted Emma immediately. Her daughter looked like a princess in a pink dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, surrounded by other children from her elite private school. "Margaret!" Patricia Pemberton approached with a smile that never reached her eyes. "How lovely that you could join us. You look nice." The pause before nice was calculated, designed to make Margaret aware of exactly how out of place she appeared among the designer gowns and jewelry that cost more than her annual salary. "Thank you for having me," Margaret replied evenly. "Of course, dear. We're all family here, aren't we? Though I should mention, there will be photographers tonight from several society publications. You understand how important appearances are for Richard's career and Vivian's family reputation." Margaret understood perfectly. She was being warned to smile, be grateful for her invitation, and not embarrass anyone with her obvious lack of social status. As Patricia glided away, Margaret found herself standing alone near the bar. The bartender, a kind-faced man named Miguel, smiled warmly at her. "What can I get you, miss?" "Just water, please." Margaret couldn't risk alcohol clouding her judgment tonight. "You know," Miguel said quietly as he handed her the glass, "I've worked a lot of these fancy parties. The people with the biggest hearts usually aren't the ones wearing the biggest diamonds." His kindness was unexpected and welcome. "Thank you," Margaret said, meaning it. Across the room, she watched Richard holding court with a group of lawyers and businessmen. At 36, he was undeniably handsome in his custom tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile confident and practiced. Vivian stood beside him like a glittering ornament, her diamond engagement ring catching the light with every gesture. They looked perfect together, two beautiful, wealthy people who had never known struggle or want. "Mommy!" Emma ran over, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Have you seen how pretty everything is? And look, Vivian gave me this bracelet." She held up her wrist to show off a delicate gold chain with a small diamond pendant. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, trying to ignore the curious stares of nearby guests who were undoubtedly wondering who the underdressed woman with the adorable child might be. "Mrs. Ashford wants to meet you," Emma continued, pointing toward an elegant woman in her 60s who was surrounded by admirers. "She said she wants to thank the woman who gave Richard such a wonderful daughter." Catherine Ashford was everything Margaret expected. Poised, refined, and dressed in understated luxury that screamed old money. When Emma led Margaret over, the conversation around Mrs. Ashford stopped as the group assessed this new addition to their circle. "You must be Margaret," Mrs. Ashford said warmly, though Margaret detected a hint of curiosity in her carefully modulated tone. "Emma is absolutely delightful. You should be very proud." "I am," Margaret replied simply. "I understand you're a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. Such important work. My late husband always said that the people who truly serve others are the backbone of our society." Mrs. Ashford's kindness seemed genuine, which made Margaret's position even more uncomfortable. She was being welcomed by the mother of the woman who was replacing her, treated with polite respect while being systematically erased from Richard's new life. The third flashback came suddenly as Margaret watched Emma chattering with the other children. It was Emma's 4th birthday party, just 6 months before the divorce was finalized. Richard had insisted on having it at an upscale venue, inviting clients and their families to show off his picture-perfect life. Margaret had worked extra shifts to pay for her share of the expenses, but during the party, she overheard Richard talking to his partner, James Morrison. "The marriage was a mistake from the beginning," Richard was saying, thinking Margaret was in the bathroom. "I thought I could make it work, but she's just not sophisticated enough for where I want to go. Emma's the only good thing to come out of it. And frankly, she'd be better off with someone who can provide her with the lifestyle she deserves." James had nodded sympathetically. "Have you met anyone else?" "Actually, yes. Catherine Ashford's daughter, Vivian. She's everything Margaret isn't. Educated at the right schools, connected to the right families, and she actually understands what it means to be a partner to someone with ambitions." Margaret had stood in the hallway, listening to her husband casually discuss discarding her while their daughter's birthday party continued around them. That night, she had made the decision to file for divorce, refusing to stay in a marriage where she was viewed as an embarrassment and an obstacle. Now, watching Richard and Vivian accept congratulations from their guests, Margaret felt a familiar ache. Not for Richard, that love had died long ago, but for the dreams she had once held about family and belonging. Emma deserved to see her parents happy, even if that happiness couldn't include Margaret. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. Would you stay and face the humiliation, or would you protect your dignity and leave? Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief of surgery at St. Mary's and one of the hospital's major donors, appeared at Margaret's side. He was in his early 60s, distinguished and kind, and one of the few people at this party who knew Margaret personally and professionally. "Margaret, what a pleasant surprise to see you here," he said genuinely. "How are you holding up with everything?" "I'm managing, Dr. Webb. Thank you for asking. You know, I've been meaning to tell you. The Blackstone Foundation has been asking about exceptional nurses for a special program they're developing. Your name came up immediately. Are you familiar with Harold Blackstone's charitable work?" Margaret glanced around the room. "I know he's donated generously to the hospital, but I've never met him personally." "He's here tonight, actually. Perhaps I could introduce you. He's particularly interested in supporting healthcare workers who have overcome personal challenges to excel in their field." Before Margaret could respond, the orchestra stopped playing, and Richard took the microphone. His voice carried easily across the ballroom as guests quieted to listen. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this incredible milestone in my life and Vivian's. When I look at this room filled with friends and family, I'm reminded of how blessed I am to be surrounded by people who represent the very best of our community." Margaret noticed how Richard's eyes swept over the crowd, carefully avoiding her section of the room. Even in his moment of triumph, he couldn't acknowledge her existence. "Vivian has brought such joy and sophistication into my life," Richard continued, pulling his fiancée close. "She represents everything I could hope for in a partner: intelligence, beauty, grace, and a shared vision for the future. Together, we plan to build something lasting and meaningful." The applause was enthusiastic, but Margaret caught something in Richard's tone that seemed forced, almost desperate. She had lived with him for over 3 years and knew his tells. When Richard was truly confident, he was quieter, more controlled. This performance felt like he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Vivian took the microphone next, her voice soft but carrying clearly. "I want to thank my parents for this beautiful celebration and for welcoming Richard into our family. I also want to acknowledge that blended families require grace and understanding from everyone involved." Her eyes found Margaret in the crowd. "I particularly want to thank Margaret for being so supportive during our engagement. Emma is lucky to have such a devoted mother." The acknowledgement was gracious, but had the effect of marking Margaret as the outsider who had been included out of politeness. Several guests turned to look at her with curiosity or pity, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Emma, oblivious to the adult undercurrents, clapped enthusiastically for both her father and her soon-to-be stepmother. Margaret's heart clenched watching her daughter's innocent joy. Emma loved everyone and wanted everyone to be happy together, not understanding that adult relationships were far more complicated than childhood friendships. As the formal toasts ended and the orchestra resumed playing, Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. Conversation stopped when she approached groups, not out of deliberate rudeness, but because she shared no common experiences with people discussing private schools, country clubs, and European vacations. She was a tourist in their world, and everyone knew it. The fourth flashback took her back to last Christmas 8 months ago. Emma had been staying with Richard for the holiday break, and Margaret had worked a double shift on Christmas Day to give her colleagues with families time off. When she came home to her empty apartment, she found a voicemail from Emma, called from Richard's phone. "Mommy, I miss you so much. Daddy and Vivian took me to see the Nutcracker, and it was so beautiful. Vivian says next Christmas we might go to Paris, and I asked if you could come too, but Daddy said grown-ups have different kinds of trips. I don't understand, but I hope you're having a good Christmas at work helping sick people. I love you." Margaret had played that message 3 times, crying each time. Emma's innocence in the face of adult complications, her acceptance of explanations that didn't really explain anything, and her unwavering love for both parents despite the tension between them, highlighted everything Margaret had lost and everything she was fighting to protect. Now, watching Emma dance with Richard while Vivian looked on approvingly, Margaret realized this engagement party was a preview of Emma's future. Her daughter would grow up in this world of privilege and opportunity, but Margaret would always be the footnote, the first wife who hadn't been enough. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below. Sometimes the most unexpected moments change everything. Miguel, the bartender, appeared beside her with another water. "You look like you could use a friend." he said quietly. Is it that obvious? I've worked enough of these parties to recognize someone who doesn't belong but has to be here anyway. Let me guess. You're connected to the groom somehow, but this isn't your crowd. Margaret almost smiled. You're very perceptive. 20 years of bartending teaches you to read people. You know what else I've learned? The people who put on the biggest shows usually have the most to hide. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. Harold Blackstone had arrived, and his presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. At 72, he was still imposing, tall, silver-haired, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had earned his fortune rather than inherited it. He was accompanied by two younger men who were clearly lawyers or advisors. Margaret watched as the Ashfords and Richard hurried to greet their important guest. There was something almost deferential in their manner, as if Blackstone's approval was crucial to their plans. She remembered Sarah mentioning that Blackstone had business connections with Vivian's father, but the level of attention seemed disproportionate. Dr. Webb reappeared at Margaret's side. Harold just arrived. Would you like me to introduce you now? He's been asking about that nurse I mentioned, the one who exemplifies dedication despite personal hardships. Dr. Webb, I appreciate the thought, but tonight probably isn't the right time. I'm just here for Emma, and I'll be leaving soon. Actually, I think tonight might be perfect. Harold specifically asked to meet nurses who have overcome adversity. He's developing a scholarship program, and your story could be exactly what he's looking for. Margaret looked across the room at Emma, who was now playing with the other children under the watchful eye of a hired nanny. Richard and Vivian were deep in conversation with Blackstone and the Ashfords, their body language suggesting important business was being discussed along with social pleasantries. I don't think this is the right setting, Margaret said firmly. I wouldn't want to impose on Mr. Blackstone's evening or create any awkwardness for Richard and his fiancée. Doctor. Webb studied her face carefully. Margaret, has anyone ever told you that you have unusual eyes? The color is quite distinctive. That particular shade of green with gold flecks. It's genetic, very rare. The observation was odd and unexpected. Margaret had heard similar comments throughout her life, usually from medical professionals who noticed unusual genetic markers. Her foster mother, Mrs. Henderson, used to joke that Margaret's eyes were her claim to fame because they were so distinctive. My mother supposedly had similar eyes, Margaret said, though I barely remember her. Have you ever been curious about your father's family? Sometimes these distinctive genetic traits can be traced back through paternal lines. Margaret felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Dr. Webb, I should probably check on Emma. It's getting late. But as she started to move away, Harold Blackstone's voice carried across the ballroom. He was speaking to Richard, but his words were audible to nearby guests. I have to say, Richard, your daughter is absolutely charming. She has the most remarkable eyes. Reminds me of someone, though I can't place who. Margaret froze. Blackstone was talking about Emma, but something in his tone suggested more than casual politeness. She turned to see him kneeling down to Emma's level, engaging her in conversation with surprising warmth for such a powerful man. Emma, never shy around adults, was chattering away about her school, her friends, and her excitement about the party. Blackstone listened with genuine attention, occasionally glancing up at Richard and Vivian with an expression Margaret couldn't read. The fifth flashback came unbidden as Margaret watched this interaction. She was 26, newly graduated from nursing school and working her first job at St. Mary's. A patient in the cardiac unit, an elderly woman named Dorothy Blackstone, had specifically requested Margaret as her primary nurse during a lengthy stay. Mrs. Blackstone had been kind but observant, often commenting on Margaret's dedication and asking personal questions about her background. "My dear," Mrs. Blackstone had said during one of their conversations, "you have such distinctive eyes. They remind me of my late husband's family. The Blackstone men all had those unusual green eyes with gold flecks. It's a dominant genetic trait, very rare outside our bloodline." Margaret had thought little of it at the time, focused on her patient's care and recovery. Mrs. Blackstone had died 2 years later, and Margaret had attended the funeral out of respect, noting the massive turnout and the impressive family that mourned her. Harold Blackstone had delivered a moving eulogy about his beloved wife, but Margaret hadn't connected her former patient to the famous billionaire philanthropist. Now, watching Harold Blackstone's intense interest in Emma and remembering his late wife's comments about distinctive green eyes, Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Dorothy Blackstone had been particularly interested in Margaret's family background, asking repeatedly about her parents and expressing sympathy for Margaret's status as an orphan. "Margaret?" Dr. Webb's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I need some air," she managed, stepping toward the ballroom's French doors that led to the garden terrace. The cool evening air was a relief after the oppressive atmosphere of the party. Margaret leaned against the stone balustrade, trying to process the implications of what she was remembering. If Dorothy Blackstone had recognized something familiar in Margaret's appearance, if she had seen a family resemblance that Margaret herself had never understood. Sometimes the truth has been hiding in plain sight for years, and we just need the right moment to see it clearly. What do you think Margaret is realizing? Let us know in the comments. Margaret pulled out her phone and Googled Harold Blackstone's family history. The results were extensive. He had been married to Dorothy for over 40 years, and they had built their fortune together starting in the 1970s. But Margaret found something that made her hands shake. Harold Blackstone had a younger brother named Thomas, who had died in a car accident in 1989. Thomas had been 28 and unmarried, but there were vague references in older articles to personal difficulties and a troubled lifestyle. The timeline made Margaret's breath catch. She had been born in 1990, and her mother had died when Margaret was 7. Her mother had always been vague about Margaret's father, saying only that he was someone who couldn't be part of our lives and that Margaret was better off not knowing details. What if Margaret's mother had been involved with Thomas Blackstone? What if the personal difficulties mentioned in those old articles included a relationship that the family couldn't acknowledge publicly? In 1989, an unmarried member of one of the city's most prominent families having a child with a woman from a different social class would have been scandalous enough to cover up. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. If Thomas Blackstone was her father, then Harold Blackstone was her uncle. Emma wasn't just a charming child who happened to catch a billionaire's attention. She was his great-niece, carrying the distinctive Blackstone genetic markers that Dorothy had recognized years ago. But these were just theories and coincidences. Margaret needed proof, and more importantly, she needed to understand what this meant for Emma's future and her own relationship with Richard's new family. She returned to the ballroom to find the party in full swing. The orchestra had given way to a DJ playing more contemporary music, and several couples were dancing. Richard and Vivian moved together with practiced elegance, the perfect picture of a successful couple celebrating their engagement. Margaret searched for Emma and found her sitting at a table with Harold Blackstone, showing him something in her small purse. The sight made Margaret's chest tighten with protective instinct. Whatever the truth about her parentage, Emma was just a child who didn't need to be caught up in adult complications. As she approached their table, she overheard part of their conversation. "And this is my lucky necklace," Emma was saying, pulling out a small chain with a peculiar pendant. "Mommy says it was my grandmother's, the one who died when Mommy was little. Mommy doesn't have any other family, just me." Harold Blackstone's face went completely pale as he stared at the necklace. His hands trembled slightly as he reached toward it, then pulled back as if afraid to touch something sacred. "Emma, dear," he said quietly, "may I look at that more closely?" Emma handed over the necklace trustingly. Margaret watched as Blackstone examined the pendant with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost. It was a simple piece, a gold locket with an intricate engraving that Margaret had never been able to decipher. Mrs. Henderson had given it to her when she turned 18, saying Margaret's mother had left it specifically for her daughter. "Where?" Blackstone's voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did your mother get this?" "From my grandmother, the one I never met. Mommy says she doesn't know much about her family, but she kept this because it was important." Margaret stepped forward before the conversation could continue. "Emma, sweetheart, it's getting late. We should probably think about heading home soon." Harold Blackstone looked up at Margaret with an expression of complete shock. This close, she could see her own eyes reflected in his face. The same unusual green with gold flecks, the same shape and intensity. The family resemblance was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said carefully, "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately. There's something very important we need to discuss." Richard appeared suddenly, his social radar apparently detecting an unusual situation. "Harold, I hope Emma isn't bothering you. She's very friendly, sometimes too much so." "Not at all," Blackstone replied, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Emma is delightful. I was just admiring her necklace. It's quite unusual." "Oh, that old thing," Richard said dismissively. Margaret's always encouraged Emma to wear it, though I've told her it's not really appropriate for occasions like this. Emma deserves proper jewelry, not costume pieces. The insult hit its mark, but Margaret was too focused on Blackstone's reaction to feel the usual sting of Richard's condescension. The billionaire's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Richard, Blackstone said quietly, that costume piece is actually an 18th century Blackstone family heirloom. It belonged to my grandmother, then my mother, and then… He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Then it disappeared 25 years ago when my brother died. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's confident expression crumbled into confusion, then growing alarm as the implications began to sink in. Vivian, who had been chatting with other guests, noticed the tense group and hurried over. Is everything all right? She asked, her social instincts detecting trouble. Margaret felt the world tilting around her. The necklace that had been her only connection to her mother's mysterious past was actually a Blackstone family heirloom. The man staring at her with growing recognition and wonder was not just a powerful stranger. He was family. Her family. I think, Harold Blackstone said slowly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet section of the ballroom, that we need to have a very serious conversation about family history. Margaret, would you and Emma please join me in the Ashford study? There are some things about your mother and my brother Thomas that you deserve to know. Richard's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, realization, and finally, dawning horror, as he understood that his discarded ex-wife might not be the nobody he had always assumed her to be. The woman he had humiliated and marginalized in front of his wealthy friends and future in-laws was potentially connected to one of the most powerful families in the city. Can you believe this twist? What do you think Harold Blackstone is about to reveal? Share your predictions in the comments below. But then something incredible happened that would change everything Margaret thought she knew about her life and her daughter's future. The study in the Ashford mansion was a testament to old money and intellectual pursuits. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather-bound volumes, and oil paintings of distinguished ancestors. Harold Blackstone sat across from Margaret and Emma, his hands folded carefully in his lap as he struggled to find the right words. Catherine Ashford had discreetly joined them, along with Dr. Webb, whose presence now made more sense to Margaret. 25 years ago, Blackstone began quietly, my younger brother Thomas was going through a difficult period in his life. He was brilliant but troubled, struggling with depression and what we now understand was bipolar disorder. The family tried to help him, but Thomas was proud and stubborn. He refused treatment and disappeared for months at a time. Emma sat quietly beside Margaret, sensing the gravity of the conversation even if she didn't understand its implications. Margaret held her daughter's hand, drawing strength from that connection while her world shifted beneath her. During one of those disappearances, Thomas met a woman named Catherine Elizabeth Morrison. She was working as a waitress while attending community college, trying to build a better life for herself. Thomas fell deeply in love with her, and for a while, she seemed to stabilize him. Margaret's breath caught. Catherine Elizabeth Morrison had been her mother's name, though Margaret had always known her simply as Kathy. My parents and Dorothy were concerned about the relationship, Blackstone continued, his voice heavy with old guilt. Not because Kathy wasn't a wonderful person, but because Thomas's mental health made him unpredictable. They were also worried about how a relationship with someone from a different social background might affect the family's reputation and business interests. So they broke them up, Margaret said quietly, the pieces falling into place. They tried. My father offered Kathy money to leave Thomas, which she refused. Then they threatened to have Thomas committed for psychiatric treatment if he didn't end the relationship. Thomas was terrified of being locked up, so he reluctantly agreed to leave town and never contact Kathy again. The sixth flashback came to Margaret now. Fragments of memories from early childhood. Her mother crying at night, looking out windows as if waiting for someone who would never come. Kathy working multiple jobs but always seeming sad, distracted. The way her mother would sometimes look at Margaret with such intense love mixed with heartbreak, as if seeing someone else in her daughter's face. But Kathy was already pregnant, Blackstone continued. She never told Thomas because she knew my family would either force them apart permanently or try to take the baby away. She disappeared instead, changed her name, and raised you alone. How do you know all this? Margaret asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Because Dorothy hired a private investigator when Thomas died in that car accident. She was convinced he had been reaching out to someone in the months before his death, making phone calls and sending letters. The investigator found evidence that Thomas had been trying to locate Kathy and his daughter, you. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. Thomas left this for you in his apartment. The investigator gave it to Dorothy, who kept it all these years, hoping someday to find you and make things right. Margaret's hands shook as she took the letter. The envelope was addressed simply to my daughter in handwriting she didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in careful script. My beautiful unknown daughter, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I didn't survive long enough to find you and your mother. I want you to know that not a day has passed since I lost Kathy, that I haven't thought about you both. I was weak and let my family's fears control my choices, but I never stopped loving your mother or wanting to be part of your life. Margaret's vision blurred with tears as she continued reading. Thomas had written about his regrets, his mental health struggles, and his desperate attempts to locate them in the months before his death. He had left instructions about family heirlooms, including the necklace that was meant to be passed down to his daughter. Most importantly, he had established a trust fund that had been growing with compound interest for 25 years, waiting for Margaret to claim it. The necklace was Thomas's way of making sure you would someday be identified as family, Harold explained. He convinced my mother to give it to Kathy before they were separated, telling her it was a gift. He knew that if you ever wore it around the right people, someone would recognize the Blackstone family crest and ask questions. Emma had been listening with wide eyes.
Does this mean we have more family than just Mommy and Daddy? Harold Blackstone's expression softened as he looked at his great-niece. Yes, sweetheart. It means you have a very large family who has been waiting a long time to meet you. But their reunion was interrupted by angry voices from the hallway outside the study. Richard's voice carried clearly through the heavy wooden door.
This is insane. Margaret is nobody special. I lived with her for 3 years. She was a struggling nursing student from foster care when I met her. There has to be some mistake. Catherine Ashford's voice was cooler but equally tense. Richard, Harold Blackstone doesn't make mistakes about family matters. If he says Margaret is Thomas Blackstone's daughter, then we need to consider what that means for all of us. What it means, came Patricia Pemberton's sharp tone, is that our family has been harboring a gold digger who has been planning this revelation for years. She probably researched the Blackstone family and planted that necklace story to fool Harold. Margaret stood up, her protective instincts overriding her shock and grief. These people were discussing her and her daughter as if they were con artists, and Emma didn't need to hear such accusations.
Emma, sweetheart, why don't you look at these books while I talk to Uncle Harold?
Margaret said gently, using the family title deliberately. Harold's face lit up at hearing himself called Uncle for the first time.
Actually, Emma, would you like to see something special?
There's a family photo album in that cabinet that has pictures of your grandfather Thomas when he was young. I think you'll be amazed at how much you look like him. As Emma eagerly explored the photo album, Harold turned to Margaret with new intensity. I need to tell you something else. Something that makes tonight's revelation particularly significant. Dorothy left specific instructions in her will about what should happen if we ever found Thomas's daughter. The trust fund Thomas established has grown to over $15 million, but that's not the most important part. Margaret felt dizzy. $15 million was an incomprehensible amount of money, enough to change everything about her and Emma's lives. Dorothy wanted to make sure that if Thomas's child was ever found, she would be welcomed into the family properly. She left you 20% of our family foundation, making you one of the primary decision-makers for our charitable giving. She also left you Dorothy's engagement ring and several other pieces of family jewelry, including items that have been featured in museums. The implications were staggering. Margaret wasn't just a long-lost relative who had been discovered at an unfortunate moment. She was now a significant stakeholder in one of the city's most influential charitable organizations and the owner of jewelry worth more than most people's houses. Harold, Margaret said carefully, I need you to understand something. I didn't come to this party tonight planning any of this. I was invited reluctantly and was planning to leave as soon as possible. I never would have approached you or made any claims about family connections. I know, Harold replied firmly. Your character has been obvious from the moment I started talking to Emma. She clearly adores you, trusts you completely, and has been raised with values that don't happen by accident. You're Thomas's daughter, not just by blood, but by character. The voices in the hallway were growing louder and more heated. Margaret could hear Richard arguing with his mother and future mother-in-law about damage control and managing the situation. The conversation revealed a level of calculated concern about social status and financial implications that made Margaret's stomach turn. What do you think happens when Richard realizes he's been treating a millionaire heiress like a charity case? Drop your predictions in the comments below. Harold stood up and moved toward the door. I think it's time to address the concerns our hosts seem to have about tonight's revelations. Margaret, are you ready to face the people who have been discussing you like you're not worthy of basic respect? Margaret looked at Emma, who was absorbed in photos of the grandfather she had never known existed. Her daughter deserved to grow up knowing her full family history and having access to opportunities that Margaret had never imagined possible. But she also deserved protection from adults who viewed her as a pawn in social and financial games. Uncle Harold, Margaret said, the title feeling more natural each time she used it. I think it's time they understood that Emma and I aren't going anywhere, and we're not going to be treated as inconveniences anymore. As they prepared to return to the ballroom, Margaret felt something shift inside her. For 34 years, she had accepted other people's definitions of her worth and her place in the world. Richard had made her feel like she wasn't good enough for his social circle. His family had treated her like a temporary inconvenience that could be managed and eventually discarded. But Margaret Elizabeth Blackstone, was done being anyone's afterthought. The return to the ballroom was electric with tension. News of the family connection had spread through whispered conversations, and guests were staring openly at Margaret as she walked beside Harold Blackstone. Emma skipped between them, holding both their hands and chattering about the photos she had seen of her grandfather. Richard stood near the bar with Vivian, both looking shell-shocked. Patricia Pemberton was in intense conversation with Catherine Ashford, their expressions suggesting they were trying to calculate the social and financial implications of this new development. The orchestra had stopped playing, and the attention of the entire party seemed focused on their small group. Margaret felt every eye on her, but instead of the earlier discomfort, she experienced a strange sense of calm. She belonged here now, not as Richard's discarded ex-wife, or as someone to be tolerated out of politeness, but as Harold Blackstone's niece and Dorothy Blackstone's chosen heir. Harold raised his hand for attention, and the ballroom fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll indulge me for a moment. This evening has brought an unexpected and wonderful revelation. I'd like to introduce you to my niece, Margaret Elizabeth Blackstone, and my great-niece, Emma. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. Margaret watched faces change as people recalculated her social status and their own interactions with her throughout the evening. The woman they had ignored or pitied was suddenly someone who mattered, someone with connections and resources they couldn't dismiss. Margaret is the daughter of my late brother Thomas, Harold continued, his voice carrying easily across the stunned ballroom. She has been lost to our family for too long, but tonight's discovery means that one of Dorothy's greatest wishes has finally been fulfilled. She always hoped we would find Thomas's child and welcome her home. Richard stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion and growing panic. Harold, surely there needs to be some verification of these claims. I mean, it's quite a coincidence that this revelation would happen tonight at this particular gathering. The insult was clear. Richard was suggesting that Margaret had somehow orchestrated this entire situation for personal gain. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Margaret felt the familiar sting of his cruelty. But Harold Blackstone had built his fortune by reading people and situations with deadly accuracy, and his response was swift and devastating. "Richard," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying a chill that made several people step back. "Are you suggesting that my niece somehow forged an 18th century family heirloom and planted it on her daughter for the purpose of defrauding my family? Are you implying that she convinced an 8-year-old child to lie about her grandmother's necklace? Or perhaps you think she arranged for her own distinctive genetic markers to match my family's bloodline?" Each question landed like a physical blow, and Richard's face grew paler with each implication. Around them, the crowd was beginning to murmur among themselves, and Margaret could see the social calculation happening in real time. Richard was accusing the niece of one of the city's most powerful men of fraud in front of 200 witnesses at his own engagement party. I didn't mean to suggest," Richard started, but Harold cut him off. "Actually, I think you meant exactly what you suggested. You meant to imply that the mother of your child, a woman who has worked tirelessly to support your daughter and maintain civil relations with your family despite their treatment of her, is some kind of con artist. You meant to suggest that in front of everyone who matters to your career and your future." The silence was deafening. Margaret could see Patricia Pemberton's face going white as she realized that Richard had just publicly insulted one of the most influential families in the city. Catherine Ashford looked like she was calculating whether her daughter's engagement to Richard was still advisable. Vivian, to her credit, stepped forward and took Richard's arm. "I think there may be some misunderstanding here," she said diplomatically. "Everyone is understandably surprised by such wonderful news. Perhaps we should all take a moment to process this remarkable reunion." But Harold wasn't finished. "There's no misunderstanding, Vivian. Richard has made his position clear. He believes my niece is a fraud and a gold digger, despite having lived with her for 3 years and witnessing her character firsthand. Despite seeing how she has raised their daughter with love and integrity while working multiple jobs to support them both." Emma tugged on Margaret's dress. "Mommy, why does Daddy look so scared?" The innocent question carried clearly in the silent ballroom, and several people actually laughed nervously. Richard did indeed look terrified, and his fear was making him more desperate and cruel. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, his voice rising. "Harold, you're one of the most intelligent businessmen in the country. Surely you can see that this woman has somehow manipulated this situation. She probably researched your family and planned this entire scene." "You mean like she planned to be abandoned by her mother's lover 25 years before she was born? Like she planned to grow up in foster care without knowing her father's identity? Like she planned to work her way through nursing school while being a single mother, all as part of an elaborate decades-long con to crash your engagement party?" Harold's voice was getting louder, and his anger was becoming obvious to everyone in the room. Margaret had never seen such controlled fury, and she realized that this wasn't just about defending her anymore. This was about Harold protecting his family's honor and making sure everyone understood the consequences of insulting a Blackstone. "Richard," Harold continued, "let me help you understand something about family loyalty. When someone attacks my family, they attack me. When someone calls my niece a fraud and a gold digger in front of half the city's social leadership, they are declaring war on the Blackstone name. I hope you're prepared for the consequences of that decision." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Harold Blackstone had the power to destroy careers, end business relationships, and close social doors that would never open again. Richard's law firm depended on wealthy clients and civic connections, and insulting Harold Blackstone was career suicide. Margaret watched Richard's face as the reality of his situation became clear. He had spent years treating her as if she were beneath him, dismissing her value and her contributions to their family. Now he was discovering that she had more social power and financial resources than he could ever dream of achieving. But little did he know, she had a plan that would expose exactly how shallow and calculating he really was. Dr. Webb stepped forward from where he had been observing the confrontation. "Perhaps I can help clarify the situation," he said calmly. "I've known Margaret professionally for several years, and I can attest to her character and integrity. When I mentioned to Harold that there was an exceptional nurse at St. Mary's who exemplified grace under pressure, he specifically asked to meet her tonight." He paused and looked directly at Richard. "What I didn't mention earlier is that Margaret has been selected for a highly competitive fellowship program that will allow her to specialize in pediatric cardiac nursing. The program is funded by the Blackstone Foundation and includes a full salary, benefits, and housing allowance. She was chosen purely on merit, months before tonight's revelations." This was news to Margaret, and she looked at Dr. Webb in surprise. He smiled kindly at her. "I was planning to tell you on Monday, but given tonight's circumstances, it seems appropriate to mention now. The fellowship comes with a signing bonus of $50,000 and guaranteed placement in one of the country's top pediatric cardiac programs after completion." The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Margaret had been succeeding professionally and earning recognition from major institutions completely independent of any family connections. Her value and worth had been established through her own efforts and character. Richard's mother, Patricia Pemberton, chose that moment to make things worse. "Well," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "I suppose we now understand why Margaret has always been so secretive about her family background. She was probably hoping to spring this surprise at some strategic moment." The accusation was so outrageous that several people gasped audibly. Patricia was suggesting that Margaret had known about her family connections all along and had been manipulating events for personal gain. Harold Blackstone's expression turned glacial. "Mrs. Pemberton, I want to make sure I understand what you're suggesting. You believe that my niece has been hiding her identity while working as a nurse, raising a child alone, and accepting financial hardship, all as part of some elaborate scheme to, what exactly? Embarrass your son at his engagement party? Patricia's social instincts should have warned her to retreat, but her anger and embarrassment were overriding her judgment. I'm simply saying that the timing is very convenient. She shows up tonight, uninvited originally, and suddenly becomes a millionaire heiress. It's all rather suspicious. She was uninvited originally because your son specifically requested that his daughter's mother not attend his engagement party, Harold replied coldly. He only changed his mind when he realized it might look bad to his future in-laws, and the timing isn't convenient for anyone. It's been 25 years of lost family time that can never be recovered. Margaret felt Emma's hand squeeze hers tighter as the adult conversation became more heated. Her daughter was witnessing her father's family attack her mother in front of a room full of strangers, and Margaret's protective instincts overrode everything else. "Stop," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the arguments. "Just stop. All of you." The authority in her voice surprised even herself, but the room fell silent as she continued. "Emma, sweetheart, you don't need to hear adults saying mean things about each other. Uncle Harold, would you mind if Emma went with you to see more family photos while I finish talking to these people?" Harold immediately understood and offered Emma his hand. "Of course. Emma, would you like to see the pictures of the horses your grandfather used to ride? There's a whole album in the library." As Harold led Emma away, Margaret turned to face the people who had been dissecting her character and motivations. Her voice was calm, but carried a steel edge that silenced any remaining whispers. "I want everyone in this room to understand something very clearly. I came to this party tonight because my daughter's father threatened my custody arrangements if I didn't attend. I had no intention of staying long, no desire to socialize with people who have made their opinion of me very clear, and certainly no plan to discover that I had living family members." She looked directly at Richard, then at Patricia Pemberton. "I have spent the last 3 years rebuilding my life after a marriage to someone who made me feel worthless and undeserving of basic respect. I worked extra shifts to pay for Emma's school clothes, while her father bought his fiancée jewelry, worth more than my annual salary. I accepted scraps of child support and limited visitation because I was told I should be grateful for anything at all." The ballroom was absolutely silent now, everyone transfixed by Margaret's quiet dignity and controlled anger. "But I never, not once, tried to poison my daughter's relationship with her father or make her feel ashamed of having parents who couldn't get along. I never told her that her father called her mother an embarrassment, or that his family thought she was better off without me. I protected everyone in this room from Emma's knowledge of how you really feel about her mother." Margaret's eyes swept across the crowd, many of whom looked uncomfortable as they remembered their own dismissive treatment of her earlier in the evening. "And now some of you have the audacity to suggest that I somehow orchestrated tonight's events? That I planned for my daughter to inherit a genetic trait that would connect her to a family I didn't know existed? That I forged an antique necklace and taught an 8-year-old to lie, all so I could crash a party I didn't want to attend in the first place?" Patricia Pemberton's face was flushed with embarrassment, but she wasn't backing down. "Margaret, you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. You've been struggling financially, and suddenly, you're connected to one of the wealthiest families in the city. The timing is just very coincidental." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Mrs. Pemberton, let me help you understand how this looks from my perspective. Your son married me when he thought I was just a pretty nursing student with no family connections or social status. He was happy to have me when I was convenient and grateful, but when I couldn't immediately give him children, when I was tired from working multiple jobs, when I wasn't sophisticated enough for his career ambitions, suddenly I wasn't worth fighting for anymore." She turned to Richard, who was standing frozen beside Vivian. "You told me during our divorce that Emma would be better off with a father who could provide her with stability and opportunities. You said I was holding her back with my limited resources and social connections. Do you remember that conversation, Richard?" Richard's face was pale, but he nodded reluctantly. "So here's what I find interesting," Margaret continued. "For 3 years, you've treated Emma's mother like a charity case who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and support you were willing to provide. You've made it clear that I embarrass you, that I'm not sophisticated enough for your social circle, and that Emma would be better off with less of my influence in her life." She paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering her final blow. "But now that you've discovered Emma's mother is actually an heiress with social connections that surpass your own, I'm curious to see how quickly your attitude toward our custody arrangement changes. Will you still think Emma is better off with less of my influence? Will you still consider me an embarrassment? Or will you suddenly discover that you've always believed in co-parenting and maintaining strong family relationships? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the room understood exactly what Margaret was implying. Richard's treatment of her had been based on his perception of her social and financial status, not on her character or her value as Emma's mother. Now that the power dynamic had shifted, his true motivations would be exposed. Vivian, who had been quiet during most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. Margaret, I want you to know that I've always tried to be respectful of your relationship with Emma. I never wanted to replace you or make you feel unwelcome. Margaret studied her for a moment, recognizing genuine sincerity in Vivian's tone. I appreciate that, Vivian, and I want you to know that I don't blame you for any of this. You fell in love with a man who was free to marry you, and you've been kind to my daughter. That matters to me. But then Margaret's expression hardened as she looked back at Richard and his mother. However, I think everyone in this room needs to understand that the power dynamic between Emma's parents has fundamentally changed. I will no longer be accepting scraps of child support or limited visitation. I will no longer be grateful for being allowed to attend my daughter's school events or birthday parties, and I will absolutely no longer tolerate anyone suggesting that I'm not good enough to be part of Emma's life. She looked directly at Richard. You wanted stability and opportunities for Emma. Congratulations. Her mother is now in a position to provide her with both, along with access to educational and cultural opportunities you could never afford. Emma will grow up knowing that she comes from a family with a long history of philanthropy and social responsibility, and she'll be expected to use her advantages to help others. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Margaret had entered the ballroom as the overlooked ex-wife who was barely tolerated at her daughter's father's engagement party. She was leaving as a Blackstone heir with the confidence and authority that came with understanding her true worth and position in society. But wait, there's something else they don't know yet. Something that will change everything about tonight's engagement celebration. Harold Blackstone returned to the ballroom with Emma, who was now wearing a different necklace. This one clearly expensive, and obviously from the family collection he had mentioned. Uncle Harold gave me great-grandmother Dorothy's pearl necklace, Emma announced happily, oblivious to the tension in the room. He says it's been waiting for me my whole life. The pearls were magnificent, clearly antique, perfectly matched, and probably worth more than most people's cars. But more than their monetary value, they represented Emma's acceptance into a family that could provide her with opportunities and security beyond anything Richard had ever imagined. Harold's expression was grim as he took in the scene. I take it the conversation didn't go well while we were gone? Actually, Margaret said calmly, I think it went exactly as it needed to. Everyone now understands the new reality of our family situation. Good, Harold replied, because there are some additional matters we need to discuss. Margaret, Dorothy's will contains some specific instructions about what should happen if we ever found Thomas's daughter. Beyond the trust fund and foundation responsibilities, she also left you her controlling interest in Blackstone Properties. The gasp from Catherine Ashford was audible across the room. Blackstone Properties was one of the largest real estate development companies in the region, responsible for major commercial and residential projects throughout the city. What exactly does that mean? Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would be life-changing. It means you now own 35% of a company worth approximately $800 million. It means you have voting rights that can influence major business decisions. And it means that anyone who wants to do business with Blackstone Properties will need to maintain good relationships with you. Margaret looked around the room at faces that reflected shock, calculation, and, in some cases, fear. The Ashfords had business relationships with Blackstone Properties. Richard's law firm had represented clients in real estate deals involving Harold's company. Patricia Pemberton's social status depended partly on connections to families exactly like the Blackstones. In the space of one evening, Margaret had gone from being someone these people could dismiss and mistreat to someone who could significantly impact their business and social lives. But Harold wasn't finished with his revelations. There's also the matter of the Blackstone Foundation's annual charity gala next month. Dorothy always planned for Thomas's daughter to be officially introduced to society at that event. The guest list includes over 1,000 of the region's most influential families, and Margaret's introduction as my niece will be the highlight of the evening. He looked directly at Richard and his mother. I assume the Pemberton family will want to maintain their long-standing relationship with the foundation. Richard, Your firm has handled several pro bono cases for our charitable programs over the years. I trust that relationship will continue to be mutually beneficial." The implicit message was clear. Treat Margaret with respect, or lose access to one of the city's most prestigious charitable organizations and the business connections that came with it. Patricia Pemberton's social instincts finally kicked in, overriding her anger and embarrassment. "Of course, Harold. We're delighted about tonight's wonderful discovery. Margaret, I hope you know that you and Emma will always be welcome at family gatherings." The reversal was as swift as it was transparent. The woman who had been suggesting Margaret was a fraud 20 minutes earlier was now welcoming her to family events. Margaret smiled politely but said nothing. She had learned a valuable lesson tonight about how quickly people's attitudes could change when power dynamics shifted. The respect being offered now wasn't genuine, it was strategic. Richard finally found his voice. "Margaret, I hope you know that I only want what's best for Emma. If there are changes we need to make to our custody arrangement to better serve her interests, I'm open to those discussions." Again, Margaret said nothing immediately. Richard was offering to renegotiate custody now that Emma's mother had become someone he couldn't afford to alienate. His motivations were as transparent as his mother's sudden warmth. Emma tugged on Margaret's dress again. "Mommy, are we really rich now? Does this mean you don't have to work so many extra shifts?" The innocent question highlighted everything that was wrong with the adult calculations happening around them. Emma was concerned about her mother working too much and being tired, not about social status or business opportunities. "Sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "it means we have more choices now. But I'll always want to be a nurse because helping sick people get better is important work." Harold smiled approvingly. That's exactly what Dorothy would have wanted to hear. She always believed that money and social position were responsibilities, not just privileges. As the evening began to wind down, guests started approaching Margaret with new interest. People who had ignored her earlier were now eager to introduce themselves and establish connections. Business cards were offered, charity board positions were suggested, and social invitations were extended. Margaret accepted the attention graciously, but with obvious reservations. She was learning in real time how superficial many social relationships were, based more on what people could do for each other than on genuine affection or respect. Miguel, the bartender who had been kind to her when she was just Richard's overlooked ex-wife, approached as the crowd began to thin. "Congratulations on your family reunion," he said quietly. "I'm glad things worked out for you." "Thank you, Miguel. You were one of the few people who was genuinely nice to me when I was nobody special." "You were always somebody special," he replied. "Some people just couldn't see it." As Margaret prepared to leave with Emma, Harold pulled her aside for a private conversation. "I know tonight has been overwhelming," he said. "Discovering family, learning about inheritances, dealing with people's reactions. It's a lot to process. I want you to know that there's no pressure to make any major decisions immediately. Thank you. I think I need time to understand what all of this means for Emma and me." "Of course. But Margaret, there is one thing I need to tell you before you go." Dorothy left specific instructions about protecting Thomas's child from exactly the kind of treatment you've experienced tonight. She was very concerned that people might try to take advantage of you or Emma once your identity was known. Harold handed her a business card. "This is our family attorney, James Morrison. He specializes in protecting family interests and ensuring that people's motivations for wanting relationships with family members are genuine rather than opportunistic." Margaret looked at the card and smiled slightly. "Morrison? Like my mother's maiden name?" "Yes, actually. James is a distant cousin on your mother's side. Dorothy tracked down several of your maternal relatives over the years, hoping to piece together more of your family history. You have more family than you realize, Margaret." As they walked toward the exit, Emma chattering excitedly about her new uncle and the photos she had seen, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed in a single evening. She had walked into the party as Richard's discarded ex-wife, tolerated but not welcomed, and was leaving as a member of one of the city's most influential families. But the most important change wasn't financial or social. It was the knowledge that she had never been nobody special. Her mother had been loved by someone who came from a family that valued character and integrity. Emma carried the genes and values of people who had built their success through hard work and had used their advantages to help others. Richard appeared beside their car as Harold's driver helped Emma into the back seat. "Margaret, I was hoping we could talk privately tomorrow. About Emma, about our arrangements, about how we move forward from here." Margaret studied his face, seeing calculation rather than genuine concern. Richard, let me be very clear about something. Emma is my priority, always has been and always will be. Any changes to our arrangements will be based on what's best for her, not on what's convenient for anyone else. Of course, I just think that given the new circumstances, we might be able to work together more collaboratively. Margaret almost laughed. Richard was offering collaboration now that she had leverage, after 3 years of treating her as an inconvenience to be managed. We'll see, she said simply, getting into the car beside Emma. As they drove away from the Ashford estate, Emma fell asleep against Margaret's shoulder, exhausted by the evening's excitement. Margaret looked out at the city lights and thought about the future that had suddenly opened up for both of them. She had money now, more than she could have imagined. She had social connections that could open doors she had never even known existed. She had family who valued her and wanted her to be part of their lives. But most importantly, she had the knowledge that her worth as a person had never been dependent on other people's recognition or approval. She had been strong, capable, and worthy of respect all along. Tonight had simply revealed that truth to people who had been too blind or biased to see it before. The next morning brought a new reality that would test everyone's true motivations and reveal exactly who could be trusted in Margaret's transformed life. Margaret woke up in her modest apartment, and for a moment, the previous evening felt like an elaborate dream. But Emma's excited chatter from the kitchen quickly reminded her that everything had changed. "Mommy, Uncle Harold is on the news. They're talking about our family." Margaret hurried to the living room where Emma was watching the local morning show. The anchor was discussing Harold Blackstone's surprise announcement at the Ashford engagement party, complete with society page photos of Margaret and Emma with their newly discovered family member. Billionaire philanthropist Harold Blackstone shocked the social community last night with the revelation that he had found his long-lost niece, the anchor was saying. Margaret Pemberton, a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, was identified as the daughter of Thomas Blackstone, Harold's deceased brother. The reunion occurred during what was supposed to be a celebration of attorney Richard Pemberton's engagement to pharmaceutical heiress Vivian Ashford. The report was respectful, but highlighted the dramatic nature of the discovery and its implications for the city's social and business communities. Margaret watched footage of herself and Emma leaving the party, noting how different she looked when viewed as a Blackstone heir rather than as an unwelcome ex-wife. Her phone started ringing before the news segment ended. The first call was from Sarah, her friend and colleague from the hospital. "Margaret, I just saw the news. You're Harold Blackstone's niece. How long have you known? Why didn't you tell me?" "I found out last night, at the same time everyone else did," Margaret explained, settling onto her couch with a cup of coffee. "I had no idea about any family connections until Emma's necklace was recognized as a family heirloom." "This is incredible! You're a millionaire! You could quit nursing, travel the world, send Emma to any school she wants." Margaret smiled at Sarah's excitement, but she felt oddly calm about the financial aspects of her discovery. "I'm still processing all of it. The money is wonderful, but finding out I had a father who loved me, who tried to find me, that means more than any inheritance." The second call was from Dr. Webb, confirming that the fellowship program he had mentioned was still available and that her new family connections didn't change her qualifications or the merit-based selection process. The third call was from Richard's lawyer, requesting a meeting to discuss modifications to existing custody arrangements in light of recent developments. That call made Margaret's stomach tighten. Richard was already mobilizing his legal resources, probably hoping to gain more access to Emma now that her mother's social and financial status had changed dramatically. The fourth call was from someone she didn't recognize, a society reporter wanting to interview her about the discovery and her plans for her newfound wealth. Margaret politely declined, but the call reminded her that her privacy had been permanently altered by last night's revelation. By mid-morning, Margaret had received 17 phone calls, 43 text messages, and dozens of social media friend requests from people she barely knew. Word was spreading quickly through the city's interconnected social and business networks, and everyone wanted to be connected to the newest member of the Blackstone family. Harold called around 11, his voice warm but concerned. "How are you holding up with all the attention?" "It's overwhelming," Margaret admitted. "I never realized how quickly news travels in certain circles. Unfortunately, being part of this family means giving up some privacy. But Margaret, I want you to know that James Morrison is already reviewing your legal situation to make sure no one tries to take advantage of the changes in your circumstances." "What do you mean?" Richard's attorney called our office this morning wanting to discuss Emma's custody arrangement. James thinks Richard might try to argue for increased visitation or even joint custody now that being Emma's father connects him more closely to our family. Margaret felt a familiar surge of protective anger. He spent 3 years acting like limited visitation was generous, and now he wants more time with Emma because she's suddenly valuable to him? That's exactly what we're concerned about. James has some strategies to protect Emma's interests and make sure any changes to custody arrangements are genuinely motivated by her well-being rather than by opportunism. After hanging up with Harold, Margaret sat quietly in her living room, watching Emma play with dolls while wearing the pearl necklace that had transformed their lives. Her daughter was still the same loving, innocent child she had been yesterday, but the world's perception of her had changed completely. Margaret's moment of reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. Through the peephole, she saw a delivery person with an enormous floral arrangement. The card read, "Welcome to the family. Looking forward to getting to know you better. Catherine and Vivian Ashford." Before she could fully process the first delivery, 2 more arrived. Fruit baskets, gourmet chocolates, and expensive wines from people who had barely acknowledged her existence the night before. Margaret realized she was witnessing the social equivalent of people scrambling to get on the right side of a powerful family's newest member. The most surprising delivery came in the afternoon, a handwritten note from Vivian Ashford. "Dear Margaret," it read, "I wanted to reach out personally because I think we got off on the wrong foot, and that's partly my fault. I should have insisted that you be welcomed more warmly at our engagement party, regardless of the complicated history between you and Richard. After last night's revelations, I realize how awkward and hurtful our family's treatment of you must have been. I hope we can build a genuine friendship based on our mutual love for Emma and our shared connection to this community. Would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime soon? I promise no social politics or agenda, just 2 women trying to figure out how to navigate a complicated situation with grace. Sincerely, Vivian." Margaret read the note twice, surprised by its sincerity and emotional intelligence. Vivian was acknowledging the awkwardness of their situation while taking responsibility for not being more welcoming. The gesture felt genuine rather than calculated. Emma looked up from her dolls. "Mommy, are we going to move to a big house now that we're rich?" The question highlighted one of Margaret's biggest concerns about their new circumstances. Emma was 8 years old enough to understand that their lives had changed, but too young to navigate the complexities of inherited wealth and social status. "Sweetheart, we might make some changes to make our lives easier, but this is still our home. And the most important things about our family, that we love each other and try to help other people, those won't change. But I can still see Daddy, right? Even though everyone seemed mad at him last night?" Margaret's heart ached hearing her daughter's concern. Emma had witnessed the tension between the adults, but couldn't understand the underlying issues of respect, social status, and financial motivation. "Of course you can still see Daddy. That will never change no matter what else happens." But even as Margaret reassured her daughter, she was planning strategies to protect Emma from becoming a pawn in adult power games. Richard's sudden interest in collaborative co-parenting was transparently motivated by his recognition of Emma's enhanced social and financial value. Margaret needed to ensure that any changes to their arrangements genuinely served Emma's interests rather than Richard's career or social ambitions. That afternoon, Margaret met with James Morrison, the family attorney Harold had recommended. His office was in one of the city's most prestigious buildings, with a view that overlooked the financial district where many of Harold's business interests were headquartered. James was in his 50s, distinguished but approachable, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from representing powerful families for decades. More interesting to Margaret was his obvious intelligence and genuine concern for protecting family interests rather than just maximizing billable hours. "Your situation is unique," he told Margaret after reviewing the basic facts of her case. "Most people who inherit significant wealth do so gradually, with time to adjust and plan. You've gone from working multiple jobs to support your daughter to being worth over $20 million overnight." $20 million? Margaret had focused on the trust fund amount Harold had mentioned, but hadn't calculated the full value of her inheritances. The trust fund is $15 million, but Dorothy's jewelry collection is worth approximately $2 million. Your foundation stake generates annual income of about $300,000, and your Blackstone Properties ownership could be worth significantly more depending on current market conditions and development projects. Margaret felt dizzy. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, unconnected to her daily reality of working shifts and budgeting for groceries. But here's what's more important than the money, James continued. You now have social and political influence that extends far beyond financial resources. The Blackstone name opens doors, creates opportunities, and carries expectations. People will treat you differently, and some of those changes will be positive, while others will require careful navigation.
Harold mentioned you're concerned about Richard's motivations regarding Emma.
James nodded grimly.
Richard's attorney contacted our office within 12 hours of last night's revelation. He wants to discuss adjustments to custody arrangements that would give him additional time with Emma and more input into decisions about her education and activities. After 3 years of minimal involvement and complaints about child support payments.
Exactly. We need to document Richard's historical pattern of limited engagement with Emma's daily life, while also protecting Emma's right to maintain a relationship with her father. The challenge is distinguishing between genuine desire to be more involved in his daughter's life and opportunistic attempts to gain access to your family's resources and social connections. James pulled out a thick folder. I've prepared some preliminary research on precedent cases involving custody modifications after significant changes in family circumstances. The courts generally look favorably on increased parental involvement, but they also consider patterns of previous behavior and motivations behind requested changes. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the legal complexities, but James's next comments brought everything into focus. Margaret, the most important thing to remember is that Emma's well-being comes first, regardless of money or social status. If Richard's increased interest in custody genuinely benefits Emma, if he's truly committed to being a better father, rather than just positioning himself advantageously, then we should support that. But if he's treating Emma as a ticket to enhanced social status or financial opportunity, we need to protect her from being used as a pawn. That evening, Margaret received the call she had been expecting and dreading. Richard's voice was carefully controlled, missing the usual condescending edge she had grown accustomed to during their marriage and divorce. Margaret, I hope you've had time to process everything that happened last night. I was hoping we could meet tomorrow to discuss how this changes things for Emma. What exactly do you think has changed for Emma, Richard? Well, obviously her circumstances are very different now. She has educational and social opportunities available to her that we couldn't have provided before. I think she deserves to have both her parents fully involved in helping her navigate those opportunities. Margaret recognized the carefully prepared talking points, probably developed with input from Richard's attorney. He was positioning increased custody as being motivated by Emma's enhanced opportunities rather than his own social and financial interests. Emma has always deserved to have both parents fully involved in her life, Margaret replied evenly. Your level of involvement hasn't changed because her circumstances changed. It would change because your priorities changed. I understand you might be skeptical of my motivations, but I genuinely want to be a better father to Emma. This revelation about your family has made me realize how much I may have missed by not being more present in her daily life. The words sounded rehearsed, designed to present Richard's request in the most favorable light possible. Margaret wondered if he genuinely believed his own rationalizations or if he was consciously manipulating the situation for personal gain. Richard, we can discuss modifications to our arrangement, but any changes need to be gradual and focused on Emma's adjustment to our new circumstances. She doesn't need the additional stress of major changes to her routine while she's processing having a new extended family. Of course, I'm thinking more about things like having input into her school choices, since she now has access to elite private institutions, or being more involved in decisions about extracurricular activities and social opportunities that come with your family connections. There it was, Richard's real agenda. He wanted decision-making power over the opportunities that came with Emma's Blackstone heritage. He was positioning himself as Emma's guide to navigating elite social circles, despite having been marginally involved in her daily life for 3 years. Margaret realized that this conversation was being recorded, or at least carefully documented for future legal proceedings. Richard's attorney had probably coached him to present his requests as being motivated by Emma's best interests, while establishing his desire to be more involved in decision-making processes. Let's schedule a meeting with our attorneys present, Margaret said diplomatically. That way we can make sure any modifications serve Emma's interests and comply with legal requirements. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her quiet apartment, wondering how quickly her life had become dominated by legal strategies and social calculations. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether she could afford Emma's upcoming school field trip. Now she was planning legal defenses against the father of her child, who was attempting to capitalize on her newfound wealth and status. Emma appeared in the doorway wearing her pajamas and the pearl necklace she had refused to take off since receiving it. "Mommy, will you tell me more about my grandfather, Thomas? Uncle Harold showed me pictures, but I want to know what he was like." Margaret pulled Emma onto her lap, grateful for the reminder of what truly mattered in the middle of all the adult complications. "Uncle Harold told me that your grandfather was very kind and very smart, but sometimes he felt sad in ways that were hard for other people to understand. He loved your grandmother very much, and he would have loved you and me if he had been able to find us. Do you think he would be happy that we found Uncle Harold?" Margaret smiled, thinking about the letter Thomas had left for her and his careful plans to ensure she would someday be identified as family. "I think he would be very happy, sweetheart. I think finding family was exactly what he wanted for us." As she tucked Emma into bed, Margaret reflected on the strange mixture of joy and complication that had entered their lives. Finding Harold and learning about Thomas felt like a gift beyond anything she could have imagined. But the social and legal complexities that came with inherited wealth and status were challenges she had never anticipated. The next morning brought news that would test everyone's true intentions and reveal the depths of some people's opportunism. Margaret woke up to find 3 reporters waiting outside her apartment building, hoping to interview the newly discovered Blackstone heiress. Harold's security team was already in place to ensure her and Emma's privacy, but the media attention highlighted how permanently their lives had changed. More concerning was a message from James Morrison about Richard's legal strategy. "Margaret, Richard's attorney has filed preliminary paperwork requesting emergency modification of custody arrangements based on material changes in family circumstances. He's arguing that Emma's enhanced social and financial status requires both parents to have equal input into major decisions affecting her welfare and education. How quickly can something like this happen? The request will be reviewed within 2 weeks. Richard is positioning this as being motivated by Emma's best interests, but the timeline suggests he wants to establish legal precedent quickly before you have time to fully adjust to your new circumstances or establish independent legal counsel." Margaret realized that Richard was treating her inheritance like a business opportunity that required immediate action to maximize his potential benefits. He was willing to put Emma through legal proceedings and custody uncertainty to position himself advantageously in relation to the Blackstone family resources. But James had more information that revealed the true scope of Richard's opportunism. "Margaret, we've discovered that Richard's law firm has been researching Blackstone Properties development projects and looking for ways to position themselves as legal counsel for future deals. Richard isn't just seeking increased custody, he's building a professional strategy around his connection to your family." The revelation was devastating but not entirely surprising. Richard was treating Emma as a business asset that could provide him with access to lucrative legal work and enhanced social status. His sudden interest in co-parenting was really about co-opting the opportunities that came with being Emma's father. Margaret felt sick thinking about Emma being used as leverage for her father's career advancement, but she also felt a steely determination to protect her daughter from such manipulation. "James, I want to be very clear about something. Emma's relationship with her father should be based on genuine love and commitment, not on social or financial calculations. If Richard is truly committed to being a better parent, I'll support that completely. But I will not allow Emma to be treated as a commodity or a business opportunity." "Understood. We're prepared to present evidence of Richard's historical pattern of minimal involvement with Emma's daily care, his recent research into business opportunities related to your family, and expert testimony about the psychological impact on children when custody arrangements are modified for reasons unrelated to their actual well-being." That afternoon, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Vivian Ashford appeared at her door with coffee and pastries, following through on her written invitation for a genuine conversation. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Vivian said, looking genuinely nervous. "I wanted to talk to you away from all the social pressure and legal complications." Margaret invited her in, curious about Vivian's motivations and impressed by her directness in addressing their awkward situation. "I need to tell you something," Vivian said once they were seated in Margaret's modest living room. "I knew Richard was married before, obviously, but he never talked about you or Emma in any detail. He presented the divorce as amicable and your role in Emma's life as appropriately limited. I didn't realize until last night how dismissively he had been treating you." Margaret studied Vivian's face, looking for signs of calculation or social positioning, but saw only genuine discomfort and regret. I also didn't realize how little financial support he was providing, or how marginalized you had been from Emma's social and educational opportunities. Richard always made it sound like you preferred limited involvement because of your work schedule. And now you're discovering that Richard's version of events may not have been entirely accurate. Vivian nodded grimly. Margaret, I need you to know that I would never have accepted a relationship with someone who was mistreating his child's mother or using financial pressure to control custody arrangements. Richard presented himself as a devoted father who was respectfully maintaining boundaries with an ex-wife who preferred independence. Margaret found herself liking Vivian despite the awkwardness of their situation. She was clearly intelligent, emotionally mature, and genuinely concerned about the ethical implications of the relationship dynamic she was discovering. Vivian, I appreciate your honesty, but can I ask you something? How much of your interest in clarifying these issues is motivated by concern about how Richard's treatment of me reflects on his character, and how much is motivated by concern about how association with him might affect your family's social standing now that I'm connected to the Blackstones? The question was blunt but fair, and Vivian considered it carefully before responding. Both, honestly. I'm genuinely disturbed by the idea that Richard may have been manipulating situations and relationships in ways I didn't understand. But I'm also aware that my family has business relationships with yours now, and treating you poorly would have consequences beyond just personal disappointment. Margaret respected Vivian's honesty about mixed motivations. At least she was being transparent about the social calculations involved, rather than pretending everything was purely personal. The truth is, Vivian continued, I'm starting to question whether I know Richard as well as I thought I did. His reaction to your family revelation has been illuminating. He's been making phone calls about business opportunities and social strategies rather than focusing on what this means for Emma or how to repair the damage from years of treating you dismissively. Before Margaret could respond, Emma burst into the living room, having just returned from school. She stopped short when she saw Vivian, unsure how to navigate the adult complexities she sensed but didn't understand. Hi, Vivian, Emma said politely. Are you here to see Mommy? Hi, sweetheart. Yes. I wanted to talk to your mom about some grown-up things. How was school today? Emma brightened immediately, launching into an enthusiastic description of her day that included telling classmates about her newly discovered uncle and great-grandmother's pearls. Her innocent excitement about the family revelation was a sharp contrast to the legal and social maneuvering happening among the adults. As Emma chattered about her friends' reactions to her news, Margaret watched Vivian's face soften with genuine affection for the child who would become her stepdaughter. Whatever complications existed between the adults, Vivian clearly cared about Emma as a person rather than viewing her as a social or financial asset. After Emma went to her room to do homework, Vivian's expression became more serious. Margaret, there's something else I need to tell you. Richard has been discussing your situation with his law partners, and I've overheard some of their conversations. They're viewing your inheritance as a business opportunity for the firm, not just as a personal family matter. Margaret felt her anger rising. What kind of business opportunity? They're researching ways to position themselves for legal work related to Blackstone Properties development projects. Richard seems to think that being Emma's father gives him special access to your family's business interests. The revelation confirmed Margaret's worst fears about Richard's motivations. He was treating Emma as a business connection, a way to access opportunities that came with the Blackstone name and resources. What did you think of the story? Leave a comment and a review about this story. Now, 2 buttons will appear, one to subscribe if you haven't already, and the other to watch other interesting stories. Choose one. Thank you for watching this far. See you soon.